I'm going to waffle a bit and then bring on our two main speakers. I'll try and keep it to not more than 5 minutes, in my own words, then we're going to give a short text view and then hand over to our main speakers. A couple of announcements first. I'm going to get them at the beginning if I will forget. If you have one of these of whatever sort, can you turn off the sound? I'll turn it off. You'll hear me okay? Yeah. Is it better if I bend down? Yeah. The other thing I want to say now, in case I forget, is that we've had a couple of great gestures of support tonight. Well, 3 in particular. A Falmouth supporter paid for the whole poly booking herself out of her own pocket, and we'd love to be able to pay it back. I wouldn't embarrass her, but that narrows it down by 50%. And if we all chipped in 2 quid, we'd pay her back and we'd have some left for XR, so that would be fantastic. Another support in kind is Falmouth Bookseller kindly agreed to bring in a single book table, which is set up adjacent to the bar, and we'll all be in the bar upstairs if you want to come up for a drink and get a copy of this afterwards. Right, that's zero announcements. I think that's it for announcements. I'm going to do a few more at the end. So just a few things. So my name's Matt. I'm from the Falmouth and Penryn Extinction Rebellion group, who've organised this evening's talk. And I'm just going to say a few words kind of on behalf of them. See if that one of those long email threads where everyone chips in an idea and manage to distill it all. So first, we'd like to celebrate the positive work that's been going into discussions between local Extinction Rebellion groups and Cornwall, Falmouth and Penryn councils, and to applaud all 3 councils on formally recognising in the last few months that we're in a moment of climate and ecological emergency. We welcome them and all of you tonight and look forward to the constructive partnerships that can now grow from these early connections as those with the responsibility to legislate and those of us working in our various communities can find ways to support and celebrate each other's actions. One specific example of this, Falmouth Town Council have mooted the idea to us of a permanent public-facing space for Extinction Rebellion and for the many other interested parties, repair cafes, transition groups, climate cafes, recycling schemes, at Falmouth Town Council's office on the Mall, which we think is a fantastic idea. So congratulations to them. It's still subject to formal approval of the full council sitting, and we're hoping tonight will help to demonstrate the very positive value that this development might have for both the council and the community. XR's a grassroots movement. It's got experimental play and creativity right at its heart. And as witnessed, for instance, by the appearance of the Red Rebels, I don't know if that name means anything to you, and then many other creative gestures, large and small, including from the school strikers, young and old, lending their intelligence, talent and courage to Extinction Rebellion's vision for change. If I'm saying XR, for those of you that don't know, it's kind of shorthand for Extinction Rebellion. So we celebrate them too. We set up this talk with Exeter University's Professor of Climate and Environmental Change, Stefan Harrison, and Manda Brookman, tireless campaigner for social and ecological justice and founder of Cafe Disruptive. What we want to do is bring an informed and open, critical discussion of what exactly we mean by this phrase, climate and ecological emergency, and what manner of response this situation calls us to as citizens, and if I can use this phrase, as ancestors in the making, whether we've got children of our own or not. So tonight's about and for you, but to be transparent, we're also here to beg for your help. The XR sign-up sheets that'll be on hand commit you to absolutely nothing except the occasional email from us, and you could duck out of that at any time. But it is how you could stay in touch and find out what we're up to. Understand, Extinction Rebellion is by no means about asking all of you to get arrested. As you'll learn this evening, there's all kinds of ways you can help. I believe me, a lot of them are quite boring. So whoever you are and whatever you bring, we celebrate that. Because the simple truth is there's no way that the dead weight of business as usual is going to yield to an alternative without all of us coming together to make that happen. So that's from us. That's from Falmouth and Extinction Rebellion. We'll say about the wins and wheres us later. This is a short text I came across today, dropped into an introduction at the last minute. Only one of the other team who was pulling this event together knows I'm going to read this. He said, for God's sake, don't. So for those of you who find it too happy-clappy, well, bear with us because we're going to have a lot of critical discussion of science tonight, and then we're going to have some quite challenging ideas put into the room about what responding to that situation means. And so before we get into the nitty-gritty, I think you could say that any movement for social change should be able to answer a simple question, which is, okay, what would you like instead? So this was pulled together in true exile spirit from a cross-section of rebels' responses and inspirations and thoughts, and likewise, it's an evolving document. It was pulled together by a centre called St. Ethelberga's Centre for Peace and Reconciliation in London. The Exile Vision for the World. Our vision is of a world where love and kindness are the fabric of life. It's a world where we share, where we care for and nourish the beauty of this great earth, living side by side with all people and all forms of life. In this world, people live in cooperation, at peace with themselves and each other. In this world, we recognize Earth as our greater body, caring for its clean water, its pure air, and the soil that brings us food. In this world, we find new meaning and purpose to our lives as we create communities where everyone matters and everyone is seen, felt, and heard. It's a world where we demonstrate love, compassion, and courage to face whatever comes. It's a world beyond borders and divisions, a world that lives in balance and harmony. All nature and all beings are seen as equal, appreciated and understood as interwoven strands in the fabric of life. Here we have regained a sense of magic and mystery to life. Our children are safe to grow, play and explore. The future is assured for them and for generations to come. We know the truth of this vision. The map to it is the map of the human heart. We know the world can work this way. We know it is what the world is calling for. We know that we have all the love, beauty and genius that is required. We will not shirk our international responsibilities for climate, social, economic and ecological justice. Join us. You will be welcomed. Bring all you are and all you have. Your uniqueness with its strengths, its quirks, its energy, all this is welcome. Your rebellion is the greatest gift you have to give. The courage of your heart and the knowing of your truth together birth the beauty of your being. It is what the world needs most right now. Bring that and let it guide your life. In this emergency, together, rooted in love, we are all we need. So if you close the curtain, call the right. Would you like that? We welcome Manda and Stefan.
This feels a bit like waiting for Godot. Tonight is the opposite of waiting for Godot. I'm going to move the chairs. Can you see a bit better now? Thank you very much for coming along tonight. Fortunately, I'm much shorter than Matt. I'm much shorter than most people. So this should be more or less the right size. But I think not. I might just wander around there. Right. Steph and I, thank you very much indeed to all of you for coming
unhinged or extremely courageous, you decide which of those categories you put into. Can everybody hear it back?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. I think at any point, if anything that I say or Stefan says at the front doesn't make sense, or you're not sure about the point we made, then please feel free to raise your hand, because there'll be a lot of information thrown at you tonight. We are going to pack a lot in, and if you leave it for a couple of slides, you'll have no idea what the point was 3 slides down the line. So do feel free, if you wanted to explain something, then please do. We will try. The whole point of this is to enable us all to understand more. And none of us know all of this. Stefan is definitely by far, so you can blame him, the most qualified person in this room to speak on this. But the rest of us actually are ordinary people and we're trying to get our heads around it. So I want to talk to you about this splendid notion of heading for extinction and what it actually means. So first of all, I would say thank you for coming, and to explain who we are, I do all sorts of work in the community and with businesses and organisations, the council and local councils on social, economic and environmental change, and Stefan is a paleoclimatologist, professor of, which means he studies why climate change happens based on fossils. Is that more or less right? You'll do a much better job of it, okay. And I want to talk very, very briefly over the next sort of 20 minutes or so before handing over to, I'm going to do some easy science, and Stefan's going to do the hard stuff, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're in the mess that we are in and what we should be doing about it. But before we do that, can you just turn to the person next to you and tell them why you think you're, if you didn't realise it was about this, now's the moment to tell them. It's not going to get any better after this. If you could just tell the person next to you why you're here, why it's important to you, why you've given up your evening. And when I raise my hand, I'll bring you all back together again. So if you could just tell the person next to you why you are here, or why you think you are here. Brilliant. Thank you. That's brilliant. We've got lots of opinions about why you're here. I really hope we're the right ones. We should say actually that it's, I can't remember if Matt said it, we are being filmed tonight, but it's broadly, if you don't want to be filmed, don't come on the stage. It sort of comes down to that really. Right, okay. Well, let me just go back. Give it away. Right. Okay. This is some of the things if you are listening, you will feel one or more of these. Because it's quite difficult, and what we would like to do today, this evening, is try and find a way of going through almost a journey of head stuff to belly stuff. The point being that unless we engage this as human beings in our bellies, what it means to be human and a friend, a parent, a neighbour, a member of a family or a community, then we're not going to figure out how important it is or therefore what the plan needs to be. So if we only engage this intellectually, like we have done barely over the last 30 years, we're not going to come up with the solutions. So if you do not feel any of these things, then you're thinking of Love Island or something. I've never watched it myself. So don't be surprised if you feel a little bit of these. That's perfectly normal. That's an entirely appropriate response to what we're going to be discussing tonight. So you're actually fine and sane and grounded and in the right place if you're feeling any of this. And we're going to have a little look at what the truth of the climate science is, why we've managed to ignore it, because we've known it for actually quite a long time, and then what some of those actions might be. So, I want you to tell me who said this. Actually, I should ask you to get to speak it without seeing the words, actually. Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale, our greatest threat in thousands of years. Climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations, and this bit here, that's us. And the extinction of much of the natural world, this is also us. This isn't about something that's happening to somebody else, somewhere else, at a different time. This is happening to us here, now, is on the horizon. The world's people have spoken, their message is clear. This is not Brexit, this is categoric. Time is running out, they want you, the decision makers, to act now. Now this man is probably, at the moment, according to all the surveys that are available, the most trusted man on the planet. And he knows this. And he wouldn't say something like this lightly. He is very, very serious. In fact, he also said, there's no such thing as being too radical right now. There are plenty of people that are saying, that we are the first generation, not to realise how bad it is, and we are the last generation to be in a position to do anything about it. This is definitely on us. And if you think that in actual fact it's all about China, or it's all about Trump, or it's all about anywhere else, that, I'm afraid, is a fallacy we're going to have to leave behind in the room tonight. This is definitely about us. We can come on to that shortly. Climate Change the Fact was aired on the 18th of April. Did anybody here see it?
Yeah.
Wasn't bad at all. It was a good start. I think there's a lot more to know than that, but I think there were a lot of people who said, oh my God, I didn't realise it was that bad. So there were a lot of people who are starting to engage with it because of what this man is doing. So it all makes a difference. For those of you who haven't come across Greta before, you can find a great deal of her content on YouTube. She recently spoke to the French Assembly and basically tore a strip off them, as she has done to the UN and various other global fora, saying that she is a child, and all the weight of this is being left on the shoulders of children by the adults in the room, which is us. So we'll come back to her in a moment. What she's saying essentially is, in actual fact, the truth of where we're at is having to be spoken by a child. And we are on the cusp of possibly irreversible climate and ecological breakdown. And we don't actually need any more evidence of that. We do plenty more research on how it's going to happen and what is happening in detail, but we know this is the situation. For those of you who might not have come across the phrase IPCC and the 1.5 report, this is going to be a crucial part of some of this information this evening. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we'll come on to in a second, produced a report in October last year that started talking about what we would have to do to keep temperatures below 1.5 as opposed to 2 degrees. That's crucial. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But those don't seem like very high temperatures, and they really are in terms of climate systems. You're going to see everything 3 slides in advance. I'm going to test you all on it afterwards. You've seen it 4 times by the time we get to the end. So essentially we feel that climate breakdown and ecological collapse is sort of happening. We've sort of felt it in our bones for a while. Who here has started to feel that things haven't been right for a while? Over the last 10 years, 20 years, but we haven't quite been able to name it, and we haven't quite been able to say why. And some of us might have been campaigning this for a very, very long time. In actual fact, it is addressed to us, and it is absolutely time that we need to wake up and step up and be the adults in the room. This is the very simple climate science bit, which is in pictures. If you're not going to follow this bit, then you're going to struggle with Stefan's bit. So this is super, super simple. Essentially, this is our only life support system. It's quite remarkable. It keeps us alive without us doing anything, all by itself, in terms of water and oxygen and food. And we are in the process of knocking it over the edge of a cliff. We're destroying its climate, which is what keeps us at a manageable and prosperous temperature. We're destroying its ecology, which is basically all the things that are living on it. The planet is going to be fine. The planet's a rock, by the way. It's everything that's trying to live in it, including us, that's got a problem at the moment. And we're destroying our future. So, in terms of the climate, very, very simply, greenhouse gases are good. They regulate the warmth around the globe. There are many of them, but we'll just look at carbon dioxide and methane on this image. And essentially, the sun is heating the globe because space is really cold. And we wouldn't be able to survive on any other planet if we don't have the sort of stable temperatures that we have at the moment. So they're both carbon-based. They stop us freezing to death. But we've been pumping we've been burning fossil fuels. We've been mainlining dead plants, effectively. And they have turned into fossil fuels, that have turned into carbon dioxide, and we've been pumping those into that very thin layer around the outside of the planet. And it's getting hotter and hotter. It's like it's like the duvet from hell, probably. So those greenhouse gas emissions are rocketing. This is what's called, this is a simple graph, and Stefan will show you much more interesting ones, but essentially, all along here, it's been fine. For a really, really, really long time, we've had a very, very stable temperature. About 2,000 years, nice and regular, living things pumping CO2 in and out. And we've got a really good system going with plants. We breathe CO2 out and plants take it in to grow. It gets a bit more complicated than that, but basically we've had a good thing going. And then the industrial age began, about here, and it all started to go a bit doolally. As you can see here, this is called, there are many graphs this shape, the hockey stick. And this is why, because it does this just about here. So these are greenhouse gas emissions, which are very complex, but essentially it means that the planet is getting warmer, and because of that, global temperatures are rocketing. And we are currently, and again this varies depending on the science, at least 1.1 degrees higher than we should be based on pre-industrial levels. Now remember that special report 1.5 degrees that I mentioned? That's trying to keep us below 1.5 or 2 degrees. We are at least 1.1 degrees now, and we've already seen what's happened over last year, and over the last 2 months we've seen the highest June temperatures recorded ever on the globe, highest July temperatures recorded ever on the globe. We've seen France with nearly 46 degrees C. 46. Netherlands the same, Belgium the same, the UK the same, busting our records, left, right and centre, for massive temperature effects. So in the 1980s, the IPCC was born, and they say this. So we're at 1.1 now, higher than we should be, based on where we were before the graph did that. And the IPCC said, it's made up of lots and lots and lots and lots of scientists, that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C will require drastic action. It's what Antonio Guterres said, the Secretary General of the UN said, it will require unprecedented change. We've never done it before, because we've never been in this situation before, in this report. And we know there are impacts being felt locally already. This is the California wildfires in 2018. Millions of hectares were burned. The Arctic is on fire now, by the way. The Pennines had wildfires much, much, much more. I come from the northwest. We should not be having fires in February. Not outside, I can assure you. Siberia is on fire. There are millions of hectares on fire at the moment, which is much more than it should be. There are always wildfires in some of these places, but this is completely off the graph. Mozambique. This year, millions of people displaced, hundreds died. And of course, we have people moving up through Latin America, driven by all sorts of things, including conflict, including corruption, including the inability to grow food. And then, of course, you've got border control weaponised by a political regime in the north, and suddenly everything gets very, very, very difficult. In Australia, last November, over 2 days, 23,000 of these bats, spectacle fox bats, fell out of the sky because it was too hot. This is a native species to Australia, and it was too hot for them. A third of the species died in 2 days. And then within a few months, in the same neck of the woods, Australia is a large place, but in the same neck of the woods, freezing floods generated maybe 500,000-600,000 head of cattle deaths. So now we start to take notice, because now suddenly it's white people that are noticing that these massive extreme spikes are taking place. Chennai. We should have seen Chennai all over the news. I didn't hear it very much on the radio at all. I had to find it online. 50 degrees C. At 50 degrees C, the human body finds it very, very difficult to cope. These are too hot. These temperatures are actually too hot for us to survive. And this is now. This is at 1.1 degrees higher than it should be. And we already know there are impacts in the UK. Do you remember that 2000 heat wave, 2003, 4? 70,000 people died. They know that hundreds died as a result of the climate change bit of that heat wave. 2014, worst rainfall in 248 years. And the Welsh village of Fairbourne is going to be decommissioned. And there's one guy I saw on a piece of reporting. He said, I've been here 37 years, and then this comes along. I'm thinking, oh my God, did nobody tell you? Had you not picked it up? We are in an extraordinary state of structural denial, where we have been refusing to see this, refusing to see that writing on the wall. 2018, this year, and it impacts us on our health, and we see that in our infrastructure, which, as we know, is already struggling. And of course, vegetable yields are hit as well. The business as usual that was mentioned earlier is not an option anymore. It's really, really not an option. Because if we continue on this trajectory, it just goes from very bad to very, very bad. Ecological footprinting. This is when we've used up the resources that we can assume that we have access to as a species. In the old days, in 1970, so when I was 5, we would use up all the resources that we were entitled to use up as a country by the end of December. That's good accounting. By 2018, it was the 1st of August. This year, it was the last few days of July. And just in case anybody says to you, oh, well, China. What about China? There's lots of water battery. China, in actual fact, doesn't use its ecological... I mean, it's not great. But it's 14th of June. In actual fact, the UK is the 18th of May. So we are worse than China because in actual fact, if you base it on per head, there are lots of people in China. Per head, they have a much lower carbon footprint than us. And of course, where do we buy all the stuff we buy? Whose emissions are they? We basically just exported them. We keep on buying them. I think most of British fridges and white goods come from something ridiculous like a 30-mile area in the middle of China. This is us. This is definitely on us. And of course, high-intensity agriculture has replaced what we knew as wilderness. Some of us will remember it. Some of us are old enough to remember what the countryside used to look like. Deforestation is reducing. This is when you start getting a situation where everything we do is making everything else worse. It's reducing carbon drawdown when basically what is growing pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It reduces biodiversity and moisture retention. Then you start to see that bad things are starting to make more bad things happen. And of course, the end result of that isn't you don't need to be a rocket scientist. This is where it starts to get very, very bad. And the oceans, we really need them also. They are absorbing vast amounts of the heat that we're chucking into the atmosphere or we're generating in the atmosphere. An inordinate amount of heat, actually. And when they are full, that means the heat has to go somewhere else. So they're a carbon sink. So basically, what's in the ocean will take out the carbon dioxide and it will exhale oxygen, just like the plants on the ocean. If we mess that up, then we're messing up another ecosystem that we're reliant on. Ocean heating dissolves oxygen, kills ecosystems, messes up all those ocean currents. The Gulf Stream is doing some very strange things at the moment, melts ice, and exacerbates storm. It's to do with how much humidity there is in the atmosphere through warm water. So basically, it starts messing everything up. And unfortunately, that's only half of the problem. We're also destroying the plant's ecology, which we rely on. So it's got land and ocean ecosystems. We're destroying both. And and Greta talks about this, we are now in the process of the world's sixth mass extinction. We know what's caused the others, more or less. We have generated this one because of the amount of carbon dioxide that is now in the atmosphere. We don't even actually know how many species are threatened, we just know that they're dying really, really quickly. There are some statistics that say maybe up to 200 species a day. I mean, that's just boggling, actually. These figures are too big for us to digest. And of course, the World Wildlife Fund came out last year and this year to say, yeah, it was bad, and this year it's actually worse. We have reduced wildlife populations by 60% in my lifetime. And that's not 6 or 16, it's 60%. That's most of the wildlife. And we didn't even know we were doing it. Or maybe we did, and we just decided that we didn't want to know anymore. And as our colleague Dougal Hines said a month or so ago, we have an astonishingly rich world, but our children will not share our privilege. It's too late now for a lot of those species, they won't be able to recover. So we have to think very, very clearly. It's taken it to get this bad before we decide what to do. But now we must. So these beasts that we assume that we will have access to somehow may not necessarily be the world that we are actually creating inadvertently, or maybe senselessly, thoughtlessly. So invertebrate numbers, between 1970 and 2018, as we've just seen, we've reduced those numbers by 60%. The trajectory looks like by 2050 we might reduce them by 90%. So I'll still be alive, and my kids will still be alive. If you've got kids in this room, they will probably be still alive as well. So this is real now. A quick guess. 100 years ago, if you look at the entire mammalian body mass, of the globe, about 100 years ago, 80% of that mammalian body mass was wild. Does anybody know now what that percentage is? Anybody, any idea?
20% went to 5.
So most of the mammalian body mass on the planet is us and the things that we grow to eat. So all those tigers and lions and giraffes, things that we talk about, things that we talk to our children about actually, that's down to 4%. I gave a talk similar to this a couple of days ago, and a guy was in the audience and said, oh my God, I'm taking my 10-year-old to Thailand to see them. And now I'm completely not sure whether I should or not. Well, got it booked, so don't enjoy your holiday, but go with that knowledge. Go with that knowledge that maybe when you come back there are some things that you might want to change or find out more about. And so the child knows as well. So it's sort of like this really, given that this is the thing that we're living on, we're not showing a great deal of enlightened self-interest. It would be bad enough if we were destroying somebody else's planet. It's actually the only one we've got to live on. And you do have to ask yourself, why would we absolutely shoot ourselves in both feet and the head so quickly? Our food supply is under severe threat from loss of biodiversity. We've got IPCC predictions, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that body I mentioned to you, talking about how bad it is. In actual fact, even they find it difficult to keep up with the science because they can always have to do it in retrospect, and it's a highly political body. So this is the only graph that's going down. These are all the various projections of what an essentially ice-free Arctic is. The difficulty is, once the Arctic is ice-free, that changes everything. I'll come back to that in a second. So this is what the projections were, all these different colours, depending on all sorts of different scenarios. The black one is observed data. So that's what's actually happening. So what's actually happening is worse than even the models are saying at the moment. And the models cannot possibly be entirely accurate. And Stefan's going to explain to you about the complexity of that, but why they're so important. But essentially, we've got a problem that's worse than the models are telling us. And the reason for that Arctic ice thing is something called a positive feedback loop. I'm going to tell you very, very quickly what it is, and then Stefan will tell you in more detail. Essentially, what does something white and shiny do to heat? It reflects the heat back. So the ice at the poles have been reflecting heat back forever. What colour is the sea when the ice melts? What does a dark colour do to heat? So this is what's happening. The more, you see what the problem we're in, the more the sea ice melts, the more sea is absorbed, the more sea is exposed. The more sea is exposed, the more heat is absorbed. The more heat is absorbed, the more the sea ice melts. So this is what's called a positive feedback loop. It's not very positive at all. It's called positive because it generates more action. A negative feedback loop would be something that stops something happening. This is making something happen. So this is a positive feedback loop, and unfortunately the IPCC reports don't include these in their assessments, and the other really bad news is there are about 70 of them. So it's a bit like the domino game from Hades, because once things start going wrong, it's a huge system that's out of control and all sorts of things start tipping over. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but you get the gist. If one bad thing starts happening somewhere else, it starts having impact on lots of other things elsewhere. And all that climate stuff and ecology stuff and habitat stuff all starts to become very, very, very unstable. And the other thing that the IPCC report doesn't mention, which is also a bit of a bummer really, we've sort of painted ourselves into a corner here. These are particulates from cars. We know these are bad, they make us very poorly, they stop us from breathing. Unfortunately, they also shield us from some of the heat. And we are managing to take particulates out of the atmosphere very, very quickly because they are very, very bad for us. They're stopping us breathing. But what they're doing is, as we take the particulates out, it's making it easier for the heat to get through. So we've sort of painted ourselves into a royal corner here. Where in actual fact, we've done so many things wrong that when we try and change things, we might be making some things worse. So this is important to know because we should not be putting our faith in any one report or any one set of data. Just know that things aren't great, and we need to make sure we are keeping, as far as we possibly can, our eye on the ball, and understanding that it's not great, and it is definitely down to us. So no silver bullets. There are some fantastic thinkers, writers, speakers available all over the internet, in all sorts of bookshops. If you find a book that you really like, then tell somebody else about it and speak. Don't use the A word. Don't go to the A place to buy anything, by the way. That's A-M-A. Local bookshops. They're really, really, really good at ordering exactly what you want, and you can have a conversation with somebody about maybe they've read it and maybe you can pass it on to somebody else. These are two great books. There's No Planet B by Mike Berners-Lee and Drawdown. We do have the knowledge to do something about this. It's just whether or not we decide to. It is absolutely down to us. And just before I hand over to Stefan, this isn't a great, it's not a great thing to look at really. This is a projection of what a 4 degrees world might look like. Bear in mind we're at 1.1 degrees higher than we should be at the moment, above pre-industrial levels. At 4 degrees, probably about 3/4 of the world's population will be living in lethal heat, which means that they're going to have a hard time living. There's going to be a hard time growing anything. So what are they going to do? What would you do if it was you? You would move. There are more people on the move across the globe than we have ever known before in history. And people are going to move up and maybe over to the west. So you can see Northern Europe, huge pressure for habitable land because Africa is mostly desert and uninhabitable. The Amazon is desert and uninhabitable. Australia, useful only for uranium mining and solar production. Southern China, land erosion by monsoon, uninhabitable dust bowl. This is great. This is just at 4 degrees. So when you say, oh, that's a global average, doesn't mean anything, it's just a bit warmer here. What we're talking about is an average. In some places, it will be much, much, much hotter or much colder. Everything starts becoming very, very unstable. So that's not a great map to think about just before sleep. But it is if you've decided to do something by the time you wake up. So essentially, this is not at all a scientific graph, but it will show you basically, this is pre-industrial, we're around about there, and then it just goes bad, very bad, very, very, very bad as it gets higher. And that is the level of change we're looking at in terms of those carbon emissions. It's a massive task. In some ways, it's almost a privilege to think we have this upon us and can we rise to this challenge, because by God, it's the biggest one we will ever have known as a species. And given that we're already there, I'm going to pass you over to Stefan.
Just making sure I can get this to work. So, yep, I think I can do that. Does that go like that?
Yeah, yes.
Is it working?
I've got the laser.
Yeah, I'm trying to get the razor to work. Oh no, here we go. There we go. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Manda. My name is Stefan Harrison. I'm going to talk to you over the next sort of half an hour, 25 minutes on some of the science. Now, Manda's talked quite a lot about the science, shown some graphs around the rise in temperature we've seen, graphs around changes in ocean heat content and other things. So I'm not going to talk very much about that. I'm going to go into some detail about what we call climate sensitivity. And we need to know climate sensitivity. It's called equilibrium climate sensitivity because it really matters. If we get this wrong, it makes 1.5 degrees completely unobtainable. And if we get it right, then we can begin to, we get a much better understanding of how we might reduce our emissions. So, I'm going to start off with a quote from Steven Weinberg, who's probably one of the world's leading living physicists. He's a quantum physicist, Nobel Prize winner. It is generally foolish to bet against the judgments of science, and when the planet is at stake, it is insane. So what we are doing, and I think Manda has shown this quite extremely well, is what we are doing is literally, in lots of ways, completely insane. The experiment we're playing with the climate system. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to try and get this thing to work first. There we go. I'm going to say where we are now in terms of radiative forcing and in terms of temperature response. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about equilibrium climate sensitivity. And this actually, getting this number right, is perhaps the most important number that we as a species have to get right, have to understand. So it's an incredibly important metric. I will then say something about impacts. I won't talk very much about impacts because I won't have time. I will say something about tipping points, perhaps one slide I think on tipping points, but I think it's an important slide. and then I'll talk about sea level rise, but again I'll only say a little bit about sea level rise and only really concentrate on Antarctica. Why? Because Antarctica is the biggest amount of ice on Earth, and by the middle of this century, Antarctica will be the main driver, or the melting of Antarctica will be the main driver of sea level rise, but also because it sort of encapsulates some of the problems we have in trying to understand how the climate system evolves. So this is where we are now. This is the land temperature percentiles in January to June 2019. As you can see, lots of places around the world have seen record warmth this year. So this is where we are, and this is the so-called Keeling curve, which goes up and down, up and down, up and down, along with changes in the carbon cycle. This is carbon dioxide and concentrations here, and then from 1960 to where we are now. In May, it was 415.26 parts per million. And it's actually gone down a bit now, because you would expect that, because of the way the carbon cycle operates. You can see it's a sawtooth pattern, as the northern hemisphere summer and the southern hemisphere summer are sort of in opposition. And of course, this rise in carbon dioxide is driving the temperature rise that we've seen, or very likely to have driven the temperature rise we've seen over the last few years, and over in perhaps this year particularly. And we are in a very particular warming trend. Manda showed that picture of I think the GIS record from, or perhaps the NOAA record, from a temperature record from the last part of the 19th century up to the present day. But this is what it really looks like. So here we have 2015 was the third warmest year in the instrumental record. We can show, this is here we are in degrees Celsius, down here at the bottom. So dark reds and purple are, is that purple? Pinky purple? I'm always told by my children I don't understand what purple and pink looks like. But anyway, this colour here, we can see it's very, very warm. And you can see that the Arctic, especially here, is warming up and warmer than almost, in terms of this is above a 1951 to 18 mean. The Arctic is warming up more than almost any part of the world. And this is called a process called Arctic amplification. The Arctic always warms up because of some of the feedbacks which Manda discussed. Partly associated with albedo feedback, reflectivity, but also associated with things like ocean stratification, methane release, increase in water vapour in the atmosphere, these are greenhouse gases. So a whole range of feedbacks which will drive the climate. So 2015 was the third warmest, 2016 was the warmest in the instrumental record, although 2019 might well beat it. 2017 was second and 2018 was the fourth. So we can show then that the Earth is warming. Of course, it's also highly variable. Just south of Greenland, you can see this cool spot here and here. So this might be quite important for our climate in Northern Europe in the future. So these are the things then, so the forcings are the things that drive the climate. So here we have, over the past 800,000 years, this is the carbon dioxide concentrations in parts per million. So here's the present day down here, 800,000 years here, and it's gone up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And then the Antarctic temperature record has done the same thing. Now they're not quite in phase. Actually, temperatures tend to go up a little bit before that then triggers changes in the carbon cycle. But what we've got is big changes from glaciations into interglacials, glaciations, interglacials, up and down, up and down. So we know then that carbon dioxide is implicated in some of the major climate changes we see around the globe. This is where we are now. And actually, we can push this graph back millions of years. So in other words, this graph could go way back, right through that wall. I don't know what happens if we go through that wall. But anyway, if you do, you could still put this graph, and it wouldn't reach these levels we're seeing at the present day. Now, when we then get into the future, we then have to use these things. These are called RCPs. These are called representative concentration pathways. Climate scientists, we can tell you what's going to happen to the climate pretty well, but it really matters about how we as a society evolve and develop and how much carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. And so it really matters if we're on a pathway which is RCP 8.5, which is 8.5 watts per square metre radiative forcing at the top of the atmosphere, or RCP 2.6, which is much lower. If we keep to RCP 2.6, then we might get away by the end of the century, say to 450 parts per million. But we're not on that trajectory at the moment. We're much more like, we're at the moment, we're on this red trajectory. And if we carry on this, we get to 1,250 parts per million by the end of the century. So us worrying about 400 parts per million is going to be much, much worse if we get to if we don't do something about our emissions. Actually, I have a lot of debate with some of my colleagues. People say, well, we're really on this trajectory here because we are decarbonising. And I say, well, actually, but the difference between this trajectory, these two, is irrelevant if climate sensitivity is high, then we still get the same temperature response. If sensitivity is high at RCP 6, then we still get the same temperature response at a low sensitivity RCP 8.5. So sensitivity then becomes extremely important if we're going to understand the future. So these are the projections of what the climate's going to be like in the future. Well, these are projections from the latest, or not the latest, these are the ones which IPCC were using, these CMIP5 projections. CMIP5 is a coupled model inter-comparison project number 5. Basically, a whole bunch of modelers all around the world bringing together the climate models and seeing what the projections look like. And here's RCP 8.5. It means the world gets very, very warm indeed. RCP 2.6, we get away with perhaps 2 or 3 degrees Celsius warming overall, but even so, look how warm the Arctic gets. Arctic sea ice is certainly going to go, and pretty well Greenland is going to go as well. We're talking about 11 degrees Celsius warming in the Arctic if we stick to RCP 8.5, or if sensitivity is high. And there are other changes as well. And most of you will have seen these, so I'm not going to dwell on this. So, the really important issue then is climate sensitivity. Now, climate sensitivity then is formally defined as the equilibrium temperature, this is an important bit, equilibrium temperature response to a doubling of carbon dioxide above pre-industrial levels. In other words, what happens when we get to about 550 or 560 parts per million in the atmosphere? We've got to remember this is a global average response, right? And there might be very wide regional variation. In fact, we know that's going to be the case. The Arctic's going to warm up more than anywhere else. But we need to know this, because if we can't develop policy to meet temperature and emissions targets if we don't know what climate sensitivity is. So in other words, it comes down to, if the climate is very sensitive to what we put into it, to changes in the forcings, the carbon dioxide, is very sensitive, then we're in real trouble. If it's not very sensitive, then we can probably put quite a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the temperature response will be rather low. So it really matters what this figure is. So, here we go. Go back. Okay, so climate sensitivity then. Equilibrium climate sensitivity in AR4, which is the 4th assessment report in 2007. The estimate is 3 degrees Celsius, but with a range, with an uncertainty. It's very unlikely to be less than that. It's very unlikely to be 1.5. So in other words, if you double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in other words, when we get to 550 parts per million, it almost certainly can't be low, and I can explain why later. It's much more likely to be around here. So we need to explain what climate sensitivity is and how we assess it. And I'm not going to go through these equations, but basically it says that if your starting atmosphere in carbon dioxide is 280, and your final atmosphere here, then you've got a temperature, and it's logarithmic because of the way in which carbon operates and carbon dioxide responds to forcings. You're trying to understand what this system's sensitivity is. So what we're looking at then is a change in temperature, a change in forcing at the top of the atmosphere, TOA, and then what this bit here, S, is sensitivity. Now we've been spending a long time, we spent a very long time trying to work this out. And the first people, Stefan Boltzmann isn't a person, it's two people. It's a bit like Jethro Tull. Jethro Tull wasn't a person. Jethro Tull were a group. I was telling that to my undergraduates. They had heard of Jethro Tull, but they think it's a person. Stefan Boltzmann are two people, and they both didn't actually work together, but they did a lot of the original science. And they worked out, using what's called the Planck response, well, effectively this is the Planck response. If you double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you get about 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature. That doesn't sound very much. And it's called the Planck response, right? And there's no debate about that. Well, there might be amongst some skeptics, but there's literally no debate about that. But we're not worried about doubling carbon dioxide, we're worried about the feedbacks which add to this. So Svante Arrhenius, then a very famous Swedish chemist, Nobel Prize winning chemist in 1896, thought the sensitivity was about 5.5, and then In 1917, we had Jules Charney, with his National Research Council group, did the first proper assessment of sensitivity, and he said it was about 3 degrees with an uncertainty value here. And effectively, IPCC have gone with that. So we think it's about 3 degrees Celsius. But the problem is, we really need to know. I've always argued, and I'm not the only person, with a paleoclimate hat on, in other words, I understand past climate change, it's quite clear that the past climate change has been much more abrupt than we ever imagined. And I and other people have always argued that sensitivity is being underestimated, and that really matters. So, these are the ways in which we understand climate sensitivity. I'm not going to go through the details. If you want to know more, I run a master's program, and I spend 2 hours, normally 2 hours, just talking about climate sensitivity, about half an hour on this graph. You'll be pleased to hear I won't do half an hour on this graph. But what it shows is that we can use the instrumental record to understand sensitivity. Here's temperature, equilibrium temperature. We can use the climatological constraints, model ranges, paleoclimate, a whole combination. And they all show that sensitivity is around about perhaps 2.5, 3 degrees Celsius. But there's a very low, well, if you look at what's called the PDF, you'll see that this is the PDF here, but you'll see that there's very little chance of it being low and quite a lot of chance of being very, very high. It could be, according to this project, this work here, perhaps 9 degrees Celsius. So if you double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which we will do, then you might get a 9 degrees Celsius rise in temperature in the end. And that would be, completely game over. So it really matters whether we get this right. A more useful metric, actually, is not equilibrium, climate sensitivity, but something called transient climate response, which basically says that if what happens in the day you double it, the day it doubles, which might be sometime in the future, 2050, 2060, the very day it doubles, what's the climate response then? And it, according to this, is about 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius. So there are lots of different metrics. I haven't got time to go into these, but this really matters if we're going to understand the future. Now, the new sets of projections, which are coming out for IPCC, which will get the next IPCC. I'm going to fall over this in a second, which will be part of my act if I do. The next generation of climate models are called the CNIP6 are coming, and they will be used for the IPCC 2021 project reports, and they have increased our understanding of feedbacks. And so the feedbacks are really important. If you double carbon dioxide, you get about 1.1 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. That's called the Planck response, and it's named after Max Planck, a very famous quantum physicist of the late 19th century, early 20th century. But all the rest of the rise in temperature we see is associated with feedbacks. Manda's already talked about some of those. Albedo feedback, reflectivity from melting ice sheets, but others as well. Water vapour, ocean stratification, methane, etc. And so these are CNIP6. These are the CNIP6 projections. They've just come out effectively. They're coming out now. And they're all showing rather high levels of sensitivity. And that's extremely worrying. Now, don't ask me why those are green and why those are grey. I emailed Veronica yesterday, and she hasn't got back to me. She may have done now, so I can look at my emails and see if she told me. I don't know why they're green and grey, but it looks like that the new set of CNIP6 sensitivities will be higher than the CNIP5. So the equilibrium climate sensitivity for IPCC was down here. The CNIP5 models were a bit higher in some cases, but the early result from the next generation will be higher, which means that if you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's going to have more of an effect than we used to think. And it also has one other major implication, that it gets even harder to keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or 2. It makes it much harder if sensitivity is high, and all the estimates are that it is high. I'll just quickly go through this graph here. This is sensitivity might be very high, and these are the estimates. So this is what IPCC says. It says that if you get to about 550, 600 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you would expect 3-4 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. But we know that in the Pliocene, 5 million years ago, 2 million years ago, that sensitivities at 300 parts per million, which we will never again see in our lifetimes, were perhaps much higher, perhaps 5 degrees Celsius to 300. Same with the last glacial maximum. So in other words, the sensitivities might be on this trajectory rather than on this trajectory, which means that it's going to get much worse, even at our current levels of carbon dioxide forcing. And just the last thing which says here just says the same sort of thing. I haven't got really time to talk about the difference between fast and slow feedbacks, but these matter because our climate models understand fast feedbacks well, but they don't understand the slow feedbacks. And the slow feedbacks give us this sort of sensitivity rather than that sort of sensitivity. In other words, the more carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, the more sensitive, with high sensitivity, the atmosphere responds very quickly. Just to show you what the models show, this is some project I was part of, the Helix project, which was run by Met Office and funded by the European Union. We will see that again. Basically, we use a whole range of what's called specific warming levels and high sensitivity, GCMs, global climate models. So here are all the ones. I love this one. This is IPSL, which is Institut Pierre Simon Laplace, which is a great French climate model. So that's the French one. There are lots of them. There's an American one. There's the HADGEN, which is from the Met Office, Hadley Centre. So they say that so different sensitivities. When do we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius? Well, you know, I'm not being rude about the French, but they got it wrong because that was 2015. So the French got it wrong. But the Met Office is much more British and conservative about this. So 2027, they say we'll get to 1.5, and 2 degrees maybe 2039, 4 degrees 2074. So we're on this sort of trajectory. And so this is what's called the specific warming levels from Helix. These are basically CNET5 simulations from using a high-end scenario, RCP 8.5, and it shows then the rise in temperature for the next up to 2100 or so. We might well get to 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, 4 or 2. And whether we do or not absolutely depends on whether sensitivity is high or low. So that's what I'm going to say about sensitivity. I'm now going to say a few things about impacts, just 2 slides about impacts, and then I'm going to talk about sea level rise from Antarctica. So Manda's talked about this, so I'm not going to really go into this. Lots of climate change impacts. The problem with all this is it might all be wrong, right? Because it's actually very difficult to tell whether these things are associated with weather, changes in weather, or they are actually attributable to changes in climate. They almost certainly are attributable to changes in climate, but it's a very difficult thing to test and statistically, and a lot of work is done on trying to understand the impacts of climate change. But one of the important issues is this, and this is why equilibrium climate sensitivity is so important. These are impacts, climate impacts, the tipping points that Manda mentioned. So a whole series of tipping points. I won't mention them all, but lots of them are associated with changes in sea ice, lots of them are associated with changes in ocean circulation. I see that Katie's in the audience, so she knows much more about ocean circulation than I do, and vegetation change and land ice change. And a whole series of these then have been modelled, and if you look at the CNET, what's called the CNET5 data set, we show that a lot of these things, these so-called tipping points, might well be triggered at relatively low levels of warming. So in other words, we're not really worried about 4 or 5 or 6 degrees Celsius in terms of tipping points. We might be worried about relatively low levels of warming, because those are when these major changes in vegetation and ocean circulation and sea ice and all the rest of things might be occurring. So this is quite a worrying, it is true, might be what's called a sampling issue about how this CNET5 is sampled, but it does show that maybe tipping points might be very sensitive to even small amounts of changes in temperature. So the last thing I really want to talk about then is future sea level rise. Here's Greenland. No, it isn't. I'm glad. No one picked that up. Luckily, I was the person who picked that up. Here's Antarctica. That is definitely Antarctica. Greenland's about a tenth the size of that. And here's the West Antarctic Ice Sheet here, and the much larger East Antarctic Ice Sheet. And you can see lots of parts of Antarctica are a long way below sea level, right? You've got, 3 kilometres of ice, which weighs, a cubic metre of ice weighs about 900 kilograms, so 3 kilometres of ice pushing down on the land, and lots of a major isostatic change. It basically means the interior of much of Antarctica is actually below sea level. And we have to worry about these things. These are ice cliffs. And the question is, how do these things break up, right? You're not going to melt Antarctica. Antarctica, mean annual temperature of Antarctica is about minus 50 something, minus 56. 2 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature doesn't melt it. What it does is it means that large ice sheets, ice streams, I should say, from Pine Island and Thwaites and other places, come into, become more unstable and move more rapidly into the oceans. So, and the way they do it, one of the ways they do it is how these things start breaking up. That might be 60 or 70 meters high, so they're big. And there are lots of ways, I won't go through the detail, lots of ways in which these things can break up. These are called carving processes. It's important we know what they are. But this Antarctica is going to play a very major role in global sea level rise by the middle to the end of the century. At the moment, most of the sea level rise we see at the moment, a few millimeters a year, is associated with what's called a thermosteric rise, which is as the oceans warm up, they expand. So most of that is associated with the thermosteric rise, just the warming. But by the middle to the end of the century, Antarctica and Greenland will take over in terms of their contribution to sea level. Now, there's a lot of work. Here's what's happening from Antarctic Ice Sheet. This is Eric Rignow's paper from 2019. All parts of Antarctica are losing a lot of mass, right? They're losing mass mainly through these carving margins, mainly coming into the sea. So these ice cliffs are beginning to break up. And the important thing then is what's the future sea level rise going to be? And there are lots of different estimates. So these are the IPCC reports, first assessment reports, second, third, AR4, fourth, semi-empirical methods, which I'll talk about at the end, AR5, the fifth assessment report, and then some what's called expert elicitation. And you can get, this is from RCP 4.5 and there's RCP 8.5. So there's lots of range, a massive range of perhaps a few tens of centimetres to perhaps 1.8 metres of sea level rise associated with melting of Antarctica and other places. So we need to get that right. And there's been a lot of work. I'm just going to give you one slide, really, a lot of work showing on this. This is Tamsin Edwards' paper, which came out earlier this year. And it's based on a paper by some work done by people called DeConto and Pollard in 2016. And it's basically, if those ice cliffs are unstable, which DeConto and Pollard think is, then you get lots of sea level rise from Antarctica. If, however, you run your models and the ice cliffs aren't unstable, then you don't get very much sea level rise from Antarctica. So that's why we still need to do science. People say to me, Stefan, we know about climate change, we know, why are you going off to why do you work in the Himalayas and Patagonia and other places, why do people go to Antarctica? It's because we don't know whether DeConto and Pollard are right or Tamsin Edwards is right. And it really matters in terms of sea level rise commitment in the future. So understanding how ice sheets behave is crucially important. Just a couple of slides left, but I really want to say that sea level rise in Antarctica also has lots of other implications. Has implications also for how the thermohaline circulation perhaps might behave in the future. The overturning circulation in the North Atlantic. It might mean, if we believe some of this work done by Jim Hansen, but also a paper actually came out this year by Nick Gollidge, also says the same thing, that it might well become that Northern Europe might be rather cold for a while as the Greenland ice sheet and other places start melting. So there are lots of interesting new science trying to understand how these systems are going to evolve. A couple of more slides then. Really, this is, so people go, well, okay, we can model ice sheets, but the problem is we don't really understand how glaciers behave. Well, these aren't really glaciers. Thwaites Glacier, I think it's Thwaites Glacier, is from here to Exeter wide, right? So it's not like a glacier you wander around on an alpine trip. You know, you get small glaciers. These are enormous things. These aren't really glaciers. These are ice streams, enormous things. So, although we understand carving processes, and I've worked on carving processes in mountain glaciers, we don't really understand carving processes on these enormous ice sheets. And there are a whole range of physical things we don't understand about how they might evolve. So some people then have said, well, we don't really need to know all that. We just need to know what was the temperature response in the past as temperatures went up and down. What does sea level do? And these are called semi-empirical methods. So there are lots of papers here, and these are sort of suggestions about what we might get in terms of, these are meters of sea level rise at 2 degrees Celsius, 4 and 6. There are big jumps here. Sometimes there are big jumps and sometimes there aren't. And it may well be because parts of West Antarctic ice sheet evolve or melt very quickly, and then East Antarctica takes a long time. But there is a debate, but clearly some quite eye-watering sea level rise commitments. This isn't going to happen immediately, but these are committed sea level rise that we will get at perhaps only 2 degrees Celsius. And there are two papers I want to look at at the very end, really. One is Rowling et al. Paper, and it assumed 1.5 times polar amplification, which I think is an underestimate. But anyway, they show that here we are, this is 2100, don't worry about these numbers, these are the old fourth assessment report scenarios, but they might say that by 3 degrees Celsius rise, that might be triggering something like 28 or 30 metres of sea level rise. 2 degrees Celsius gives us perhaps 20 metres, eventually. It's not going to happen tomorrow, it might be the end of the week. And this is, I often use this one, this is the final example of using the paleo record. This is where we are today at sea levels of 0, with a global mean temperature of about 14.5, 15 degrees Celsius. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets reached the Scilly Isles, the northern part of the Scilly Isles, for instance, most of Britain was under ice, most of North America was under ice. Sea levels were around about 120, 125 metres lower than they are now, right? So that's only about a 6 degrees Celsius cooling. So if I could play God for a moment and cool the climate by 6 degrees Celsius, eventually I can generate an ice sheet covering most of the British Isles, and I can reduce sea levels by 120 metres. So that's what it's like at the LGM. This is what it was like 120,000 years ago in the previous interglacial, the Eemian. In Britain we call it the Ipswichian, but we tend to call it the Eemian interglacial 120,000 years ago. Temperatures were probably a bit higher than now. Sea levels were certainly higher, perhaps 6 or 7 metres higher than they are now. The Pliocene 3 million years ago, temperatures perhaps 1 or 2 degrees Celsius warmer than now. Sea levels may be 20 metres higher than they are now. And the Eocene, 5 degrees Celsius warmer or so, and 70 or 80 metres of sea level rise. Now, where we're forecast to get to, if we're really, really, really good, we might get to 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. But I don't think we will. I think climate sensitivity is such that between you and me, there's no chance of keeping to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Or 2, I wouldn't say, but anyway. So we might end up with 4 or 5, in which case we're going to be up here. Well, if this graph is right, and you draw that up to there, then eventually we end up with 70 metres of sea level rise. But it all depends. So these are semi-empirical methods, and I think they're really important because they tell us about what has happened in the past. As somebody once said, if this climate change has occurred in the past, we know it can happen. Well, we know this can happen. So my penultimate slide then is this. This is by a friend of mine, David Wasdell, and he did this in relation to Kyoto, which is the previous attempt to keep climate change under control. And basically he says that here we have this sort of increasing global heating, he calls it. Well, this is global warming. And here's time. And we're on this scenario here. And the problem here is a tipping point, or maybe lots of tipping points. And the problem is you're going up this hill, and you suddenly slip down the other side, and you can't get back again. That's what tipping points are like. So the question is, where are we on this graph? Hopefully he thinks we're on this, we're going to just get close and then get down here, because we'll be very sensible and politicians will take note of all this. That's what I'm feeling. When I get out of bed on the right side of the bed in the morning, I think we're on this scenario. And then I think, actually, we're probably not. We're on this scenario. So this is, it's a graphic about what we think climate change might be like. So we don't know where we are on this graph, and we don't know what this. We may be way down here. Who knows? We don't know. But climate sensitivity is an important part of that. So my conclusions then are these. Climate sensitivity is, I think, pretty clear. CMIP 6 says, CMIP 5 didn't say, but all the paleoclimate records say climate sensitivity is high. And most projections, therefore, are likely to be very conservative. In other words, and Manda showed that they can't even get sea ice right in the Arctic. So I think that our projections of future climate change and perhaps sea level rise may be erring on the more conservative side. If so, keeping to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees warming is much more difficult than we ever thought. There are a whole series of irreversible impacts which might be triggered at even relatively low levels of warming. A lot of the tipping points which Manda mentioned, which I showed, might not occur by the end of the century, might be occurring now. And they might, if those CMIP 5 model projections are right, then these irreversible impacts might well be triggered at low levels of warming. And the problem is, once we cross a tipping point, we can't go back. Thanks very much.
Okay, so that was really bad news. In an upshot, we're talking about, we're 1.1. We are really unlikely, as some other climate scientists have said, we've probably got a 5% chance of staying underneath 1.5 degrees. We're on the trajectory to way above 2. The stuff about the particulates that I mentioned and the feedback loops means there is probably at least 0.2 to 1.1 extra degrees in the system, locked in the system, that we won't be able to do anything about. So we are already headed way above 2 degrees. The Met Office has said that we are probably going to breach 1.5 degrees within the next 5 years. That's the Met Office. And the difficulty is we're going to do this. We're going to breach it and come back, and breach it and come back. And as already seen, there's a lot of instability in the system now. It's been stable for a really long time, about 11,000 years. We've come along, poured a ton of carbon dioxide and other things into it, and now it's just gone completely unpredictable. And these are complex systems. We don't know what's going to happen. So the point of this is the science is trying really, really, really hard to understand all the different scenarios. None of them are good. But we now have an opportunity to decide whether or not we choose to try and do everything we possibly can, build a collective psychological existential kitchen sink in it and keep it one of the ones that goes like this, or stay on the one. We are already on it. It's not something that might happen if we do something. It's what we're going to stay on if we don't do anything that does this. And of course, as we've already established, some of these tipping points might be arriving on our doorstep before 2050. Now, what that means is that is definitely within my kids' lifetime. So by the time we get to the end of this 12-year period that the IPCC said we had in order to change everything, my children will be at the age that I was when I decided to have children. And by the time we get to 2050, which is as far as we're willing to look really as human beings, they're going to be my age now. So what does 2070 hold for them, actually? And all of the people of that age that we know. So I just want you to take a moment now and tell the person next to you how you feel about that. I mean, maybe you know it all and it's not news and you're completely all over the science and you're not dead happy about it, but at least you feel as if you know what's happening. Or maybe you haven't seen some of that before. But can you just share that with the person next to you just for a moment and let them know how you feel, not what you think, but how you feel. Okay, 1 minute from now. One of the problems is we haven't really talked about it. We've left it all of this over to the climate scientists to figure out what's going on, and we've just assumed that it's not our job. And we haven't talked about it. We really, catastrophically, have not talked about it. So the first thing you do when you go home tonight and tomorrow is find a way of starting a conversation about this, either to somebody who knows lots and lots about it, or somebody who's never had a conversation with you about it before. That might be the hardest thing you ever do, actually. But in actual fact, we need to talk about this, otherwise it's not real. As John Berger, the remarkable writer and author and artist, said, we only see what we're looking at. And we've done a really good job of not seeing this. So have a conversation, start thinking about this. The important thing, the really important thing that's part of that talking to somebody is this is a very bad thing to do by yourself. This is a bit of a head wrecker. And in fact, a number of people have said that when they've heard these talks, it's very different being in a room like this with a lot of people, hearing a lot of science, which is quite difficult to digest technically and emotionally. But that's much better than doing it at home, watching it on a screen. So if you do watch stuff at home on the screen, either have a lot of alcohol, or a friend with you, or a family group, or colleagues, whatever it might be, but digest it in company, actually, because we tend to digest it much better when there's somebody else in the room as well. So I want to talk a little bit about why we're here, how we have got ourselves into this position now. And it's really to do with the contrary hot mess that is the human psyche and our incredible ability to stick our head in the sand if things are just a bit too complicated for us, and to assume that somebody else has got this, somebody else is sorting it out, aren't they? And in actual fact, It is definitely us. So we do invest quite a lot of our time and money and effort into what's called magical thinking, which is basically assuming that somebody else is going to sort it out. And it's all going to be fine. We've done this economically, we've done it environmentally and climatologically, we've done it socially, that basically we'll start something off and then this happens and it'll all be all right. That's clearly not the case now. There's a lot of uncertainty, as Stefan has said, that's actually baked into the system. So we have to assume we've got a lot of uncertainty. So when we need a strategy that doesn't assume that one particular thing is going to happen. We need a strategy that encompasses possible events from here to here. That's what a decent strategy looks like. So at least we've got half a chance of being prepared. And we have been really, really deceitful with ourselves and with each other. This is Kevin Anderson, who's a fantastic climate scientist, actually, another fantastic climate scientist. He's also from Manchester, I'm just saying that, putting that out there. And he's been saying this for a really, 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 really long time, and of course being ignored. You'll never hear him, very rarely hear him on the radio. And he talks about how people don't talk about it. We've almost got like a silence and a meta-silence. We've got a silence about this, a socially constructed silence, and then a silence about silence. As Kevin Anderson says, if you drink half a litre of beer with a politician or scientist, they'll tell you how bad it is. But if you put a microphone there, they'll tell you some optimistic nonsense. That's a scientific term. He's invented some optimistic nonsense about climate change. He also refers to it as astrology. And he's really, really, really teed off with this because he's been looking at the same stuff that Stefan's been looking at, and you can see that in actual fact these graphs aren't looking good at all, but we're still managing to ignore them. So in terms of Extinction Rebellion's response, you can see now why the name Extinction Rebellion sort of resonates with a lot of people once they start looking at the science. If we're looking at those temperatures that Stefan mentioned, if we are looking at beyond 1.5, beyond 2, maybe 3 to 4, and I can tell you now that there are many, many climate scientists that think we are definitely on score for 3 to 4 degrees by the middle of the century if we carry on now. This is not just an end of century thing, and they've been thinking it for a while. And that is definitely spelling out extinction for all sorts of species, and it's not looking great for us. Because although we have failed to acknowledge it, we are absolutely, profoundly, completely reliant on all the things we are currently destroying. It's like being in a really big boat and somebody's making a hole at one end and somebody at the other end says, all right, it's not at this end. Not understanding that we're all part of the same system and all absolutely up to our knees involved. And there are some obvious questions that come to us when you think about how dangerous it is, really, because we sort of assume that the first, anybody know what the first responsibility of a government is? It's to keep its citizens safe. Now, being completely apolitical, I would say they haven't done a banging job of that so far, any of them. We are not safe right now. And the problem is, this has been going on for quite some time. These are some examples. This is a completely apolitical. It doesn't matter who it is in charge, but in actual fact, this is what has happened. So, Sajid Javid in 2016 overturned the local council, my bloody council's, county council's decision not to have fracking. He overturned it. Now you've probably heard in the press what's happened with Quadrilla and the impacts and the response from the community. Heathrow, massive big deal about Heathrow. Don't even know if in actual fact it's going to be complying with our own laws. It's certainly not going to help with all the stuff that Stefan's just told you. But we're still planning on a third runway. And this is Amber Rudd, who in 2015 announced a 65% cut to renewable energy subsidies when the UK is the only G7 nation increasing fossil fuel subsidies. And we're currently seeing a situation now, in the next few months we will see a 5% VAT impact on coal and a 20% VAT impact on renewables. So this is the government that's supposed to be making sure we're making the right decisions. Now clearly some things have gone right. The point is it's nowhere near enough. It's nowhere near enough. And the BBC. This isn't because people are bad or stupid, it's because they get lost in their own space and they like to hear and listen to their own stories. The BBC has been just catastrophically rubbish at covering this by its own admission. And there was a bit of a hoo-ha last year that you might remember when they acknowledged that maybe they didn't need another climate denier on the BBC. And as the brief, that Carbon Brief, an organisation obtained, said, climate change has been a difficult subject for the BBC and we get cover of it wrong too often, they said, I think. So they did actually change their mind. One of the reasons they changed their mind is Rupert Reed, who's a professor, he's an environmental philosopher based up country. He came down here to talk with us a couple of weeks ago, gave an astonishing evening chatting about what this meant in terms of our response. He was actually asked to go on the radio again to talk with a climate denier again, and he refused. He just said, I'm really sorry. You know, you wouldn't invite me to talk about whether or not the world was flat. Climate change is happening. Climate breakdown is upon us. I'm not going to grace your request by acknowledging the fact that somebody who says it isn't happening has got a new room now. And he tweeted it out. He woke up in the next morning and it had something like 30,000 retweets. He went completely viral. Loads and loads and loads of people contacted him, including the BBC. They said, okay, you might have a point. And they started to think about what they were covering, this notion of being impartial. And in 2018, they finally said, to achieve impartiality, you do not need, this is BBC, you do not need to include outright deniers of climate change in BBC coverage, in the same way you would not have someone denying that Manchester United won 2-0 last Saturday, the referee has spoken. So they decided that in actual fact they hadn't been covering it at all, and of course that is one of their first actions. Now the reason that is really, really, really important in terms of this socially constructed silence is, as noted by RTE, which is the Irish Broadcasting Corporation, when they were given a hard time last year as well, the Director General then came out with this response. As a broader point, if there is little by way of action on climate change in terms of legislative change, so that's the law, it's not science, policy initiatives, so that's the law, not science, parliamentary debate, so that's the law, not science, and business innovation, so that's business, not science, regrettably, there is less for the media as a whole to report on, she said. What she's basically saying is, if the government isn't doing anything, then we don't say anything. So if we don't say anything as the media, then nobody knows about it. If nobody knows about it, the government, do you see how it works? Beautiful, beautiful, perfect loop. The point is, they should have been reporting on the fact that the government wasn't doing anything about it. That was a news story, not to not talk about it at all. So this is how the silence gets locked into the way in which we engage. We've done it all, you know, we've done it in Rwanda, we've done it in the Holocaust. It's what's called different sorts of states of denial, where we just decide it's too complicated and it's easier not to think about it. And we do that individually and structurally, institutionally. And this is a problem when it's the institutions that are here to keep us safe or the institutions that are here to inform us. So, I won't say anything if you don't. So the obvious question is, doesn't the law help if in actual fact the right things aren't happening? Well, in actual fact, that hasn't always been, go back, that hasn't always been the case. If she hadn't done that, I wouldn't have the vote now. And neither would half of this room. Polly Higgins, she died the last couple of months. She's been trying to develop an ecocide law because we've decided we need to make it illegal to trash the only planet we live on. We're an extraordinary species. Now she died, her colleagues are continuing that fight. And in fact, just after she died, one of her colleagues went to Scotland to give a talk in her place, obviously very moving, and she said, right, I just have one thing to say really, and that is that if you are alive today, you have a job to do. And there was complete silence in it. Yeah, she died trying to do this. And of course this fella here, he knew that in actual fact he had to break some rules in order to make the change that was required, as Caroline Lucas has clocked as well. So we need maybe to change the way we think about what we decide is right and wrong. There's a difference between what is right and what is legal, where justice sits and where the law sits. And if we look at what's happened, we see in actual fact this is maybe why there have been responses that we've seen. So one of the things, and Matt says it isn't all about this, but this is why, this is the theory of change behind what Extinction Rebellion has been doing about this existential threat. An existential threat, by the way, is a threat that threatens our existence, which is about as big as a threat gets. These kids, these black and white kids, are in Woolworth's diner in Jackson, Mississippi, about 1963. They knew that if they went into that diner, it was absolutely illegal, and they knew that they were breaking social and state laws. So they practiced beforehand because they knew what response they'd get. And they made their friends pour mustard and ketchup and salt and pepper over their heads so that they could remain completely non-violent in the face of that physical and verbal assault, because they knew they had to remain non-violent, and they were putting themselves effectively in the lion's den. This was one of the turning points, along with the Freedom Riders, the turning points. Absolutely, incontrovertibly, immovably peaceful and non-violent, because that way you can start to clear a space to have the conversation. If they fought back, that would have been a very different story. So they humiliated themselves and went through an incredible sacrifice, but it made a massive difference, an extraordinary difference to the civil rights movement in the South. And as our guy John said, when it gets down to having to use violence, then you're playing the systems game. And you can be talking structurally or individually here. Because once they've got you to violent, then they know how to handle you. The only thing they don't know how to handle is non-violence and humour. So it's really important this is about peacefully saying we need the change. This is a psychology professor in Bristol. It's a good chap. I've spoken to him on a number of occasions, and he started to get himself arrested before Christmas last year. He doesn't study the psychology of climate change, he studies different sort of neuroscience psychology, but he said he's very frustrated not being able to do this in his work. He was very frustrated at what wasn't happening, either in the university or further abroad, across the government or elsewhere, and so he started to get himself arrested. And this is one of my mates outside the BBC broadcasting out in Bristol over the winter, with a megaphone saying, "We demand the BBC cover climate change," he's retired, "cover climate change properly and tell us the truth. It is their duty to inform and educate as well as to entertain." And these are her friends. So she's a retired librarian, her mate's a retired teacher, and this woman, Diane, was a working GP, and she said, "I cannot possibly keep people well individually on a day-to-day basis if I know this is coming. How can I possibly keep people well? It's going to hit the most vulnerable and the most impoverished first." A Bristol GP. So then she became a retired GP and started to work with Doctors for Extinction Rebellion, who were saying, we cannot be doctors unless we take this seriously. So this isn't about your purple tasseled hippies doing weird things. This is about everybody stepping up and saying, actually, this is on us now. This is definitely on us. And Diana was one of the ones who superglued herself to the DLR in London at that point, and deeply non-violent protest, but it was to try and get attention. As did she. All by herself. There was nobody who sat with her outside the Swedish Parliament when she sat by herself and started striking for the climate, school strike for climate. Completely non-violent. She was 16. She was even younger then, actually. And suddenly you've seen a movement that is now global, because she was brave enough to say, this is definitely something that I need to challenge. And these are kids in Australia. Everybody's getting involved. That sign in the middle, the black one, it says Scott Morrison. You're so full of SHIT, the toilet is jealous, which I think is quite an inventive way of making it. Jealous, but JELOUS, which is cross. And these guys, these are in Belgium. And for reasons that can only be known to the minister, I think it was the education minister, said, the security forces are working in concert with the children against me. It's really not fair. Until the security forces said, no, we're not. And the minister had to resign. So these are kids saying, this is not okay anymore, actually, and we're going to do things that we thought we never could. But as we've seen, sometimes in order to make the change required, we've got to go against the rules that aren't working anymore. We made the rules. They weren't given to us in tablets of stone. It's up to us. And we do. So we've seen this all over Cornwall. This is in Truro. And we've seen the same in St Just and in towns and parishes all over the county and elsewhere. And then not long after that, in February this year, 224 academics came out, spurred on by the first school strike, to say, actually, the kids are right. The kids are right. The following week, teachers said, yeah, the kids are right. We can't even teach this properly. We've got to sort of try and slice it in, squeeze it into the curriculum, whereas in actual fact we should be talking about this because these are the people who are going to be walking into this face first by the middle of the century. What are we doing? So it's simply about stepping up, about saying, yeah, this is on me and there's something that I can do about this, whatever it might be. And there are many, many things that can happen. This is what, if you want to know what 224 letter-signing scientists look like, and there are many of them from Cornwall and the southwest actually, this is half of them. Hundreds of councils have declared a climate emergency all the way across Cornwall and Cornwall Council. Cornwall Council was the first county to declare a climate emergency, which takes us on to the 3 simple demands that XR has. And every time I read this, I think these cannot possibly be seen as radical. The government must tell the truth. That seems to me incredibly reasonable, actually. I'm not sure why we're having to ask for it. The government must tell the truth about the ecological emergency, reverse inconsistent policies, as we've seen, and work alongside the media to communicate with citizens. Isn't that's right? That would be normal. One would expect that, I would have thought. So these aren't really, really weird and out there. This is page 1 of how to be a decent government, I would have thought. So, interestingly, after all that hoo-ha, when all those people did weird things in London, in actual fact, that was what was required. As we've seen, sometimes you need a real intervention to make the difference, because we haven't managed to make that difference over the last 30, 40, 50 years. Because this was known about in the 1950s by the oil lobby. Bear that in mind. So in April, Mark Carney told global banks they can't ignore climate change dangers. That hadn't happened before. 23rd of April, our previous PM was empty-chaired as Greta met party leaders in London. A number of days later, Nicola Sturgeon declared a climate emergency at the SNB conference, quickly followed by the Welsh Government. So it suddenly, it's moving into very, very mainstream territory. And after weeks of protest, and I can just say that in actual fact I was on the Waterloo Bridge, that's the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. Absolutely terrifying, because when you're approached by a phalanx of 100 police, Met Police, and their big yellow jackets, and you don't know how they're going to respond, and they don't know how you're going to respond, everybody was terrified. But it's not actually a difficult decision to make when you understand what the alternative is. So the UK became the first parliament. The government hasn't declared a climate emergency yet. That'll come. But Parliament has, on the 2nd of May. And these are the Red Rebels that Matt was talking about. And their role, they were an extraordinary role. Their role is to, almost like a Greek chorus, but also to express the grief that was felt. There was a great deal of love and affection and tears and also crying in London over that April fortnight, because there were incredible connections made by individuals. So I'm really scared. I've never done this before. I've never been arrested. I've never been on a street march. I've never sat down in the middle of the road. I've never even talked to a policeman before. I've never handed out leaflets. I've never got involved in anything. And the number of conversations of that nature that were held were quite extraordinary. And people were scared and were grieving. And these guys are representing the grief as people were taken away. Over 1,000 arrests, peacefully. Takes us to our second XR demand. The government must enact legally binding policy measures to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025 and to limit the global ecological footprint to half the planet, what we were talking about at the beginning. Net zero by 2025 is really, really demanding, and there are people that are saying that can't be done. I think everyone's saying we've just got to try really, really, really hard, because we've seen from the stats that in actual fact we are heading on completely the wrong top red trajectory. So this needs everything from everyone now. And thirdly, demanding a citizens' assembly, which is really a different way of engaging with very, very tricky things, so it doesn't all sit on the shoulders of a few of our elected representatives, because it is on all of us. And just in case you haven't heard of it, essentially, citizens' assembly is developed through a notion called sortition. It's very, very ancient, and it's effectively like a people's jury, or a grouping together of random people, randomly selected from our communities, so that they can have an opportunity to engage with a very, very complex issue and talk to people with views they might not have had before, to deal with a very tricky, can you see where I'm going with this? Very tricky binary issue. Can you imagine if we'd actually had a conversation about Brexit before we made that decision? We might have been hearing views that we've never come across before because we don't speak to each other properly. So it's a fantastic way of moving from public opinion to public judgment, and deal with us because we are going to have to make some very, very difficult decisions as we come up. We're going to decide what to let go of and what we want to keep, because we cannot have our carbon cake and eat it. It just doesn't work. The maths, there isn't enough now. So essentially you've got randomly selected citizens who hear from experts and stakeholders. Submissions are offered. There's really, really carefully and expertly facilitated. Then recommendations are voted on, and then the government reviews and implements. So it is a fantastic complementary part of the democratic and representative process. And I think credit to a number of councillors in Cornwall, in actual fact, who we've had a number of conversations with over the last few weeks, who have, and months, who've started to say, yes, I was anxious about this at first because I thought you were doing what I was supposed to do, but I completely see now this is part of having a much more comprehensive and fair discussion about really tricky issues. And we want it because it can encompass those big issues and it can't be influenced. There's no lobbying a citizens' assembly. And it has dealt with some very tricky issues, for example, abortion in Ireland. And I'm thinking, well, if it can tackle that and come out with some sort of sensible route forward, then I think that it definitely deserves looking at. Derek Thomas, in May, supported the Declaration of Climate Emergency and Citizens' Assembly. Thank you, Derek. And of course, as a result of all that supergluing, then a number of people from Extinction Rebellion met part of the government just after April and started to have a conversation that had never happened before. It's called Moving the Overton Window, where previously we didn't talk about it, that socially constructed silence, and now in actual fact we are. It's on the radio now, it's actually on the radio. We just need to step up in there. And more people now are saying, in actual fact, this is definitely something that I think is important and I want to do something about. So, whether you're talking about a school in St Just, or sitting there, there's something that everybody can do, even if it's just having the conversation. There are many Extinction Rebellion groups now, all over the world, all of them doing all sorts of different things, some getting arrested, many not, in order to try and have this conversation and say, we're right at the cliff edge now, we don't know how deep it is, we don't know how sharp the rocks are on the edge, but we know it's a cliff edge. So I would say to you just three things in terms of what you can do. One is definitely talk with each other and other people about this and find out more. The not doing it alone thing. The second thing is use your vote. I was impressed when Derek said that during the Tory leadership election he actually wrote to all the leadership candidates and said, okay, tell me what you're going to do about the climate emergency and then I'll consider voting for you. And I thought, okay, that's how democracy should be working. And then thirdly, and if the people that you can vote for don't get this, then tell them. You pay for them. You're their boss. This is why it's down to us. And join something, whether it's Extinction Rebellion or whether it's a bowling group or a foraging group or a walking group or a book club, but find the others, find your others, and then find other others who maybe wouldn't have had that conversation without you. This is definitely something to be done collectively. So just to finish off, it doesn't really matter which graph you look at, they all look like that. And the problem is, I have one of those and one of those. And they were both back with me this weekend. Ruby has been working with migrants fleeing from unimaginable destitution and conflict all the way across the Middle East and Africa for 4 years as a volunteer. And Lou's doing graphics for social change in Bristol because he wants to deal with the migrant and refugee crisis and homelessness in Bristol. And I'm thinking, bloody hell. So our kids are on this. And the difficulty is, there's another one of those graphs. If we are looking at 1.5 degrees, which we've already established is very unlikely that we're going to keep underneath within the next 12 years, Ruby will be 34, Lou will be 31, and we will be about here. And the thing that really worries me is this bit here. Because that's where we're sending all of our Rubies and Louis, that's where we're sending all of our grandkids, unless we decide to do something about this today. So, if we assume that to change everything, it will take all of us in this room, and as Kevin Anderson said, in natural fact, the top 10% of us are responsible for 50% of the emissions, so none of this, what about somewhere else? If you're in this room tonight, you will probably be in the top 10%. This is about the decisions that we all make, me included, all of us. And if you want to know how to start, then Lucy Isaacson, who is in Cornwall, has developed the Climate Vision 10 Pledges, where you can just start with a pledge to do something different. It could be how much meat you eat a week, where you get your energy from, how you take your holiday. There's a possibility of doing something about this within the next few hours. So if our core activities are actions, bear in mind that some are conceived and planned locally. You will see the Red Rebels around Cornwall, and you will might have seen the fast fashion event a couple of weeks ago. Some are planned nationally. Some of it is really about just having conversations as well as getting arrested. For every arrestable, there are 20 plus others supporting those people. And just remember who we saw that had to break the law to say, actually, this isn't okay. We need to change something about this now. There are many, many, many things that we can do to make sure that we have those conversations in terms of sharing information, informing ourselves, talking to other people, getting involved, enabling our local groups to start thinking about this. Or you can make yourself arrestable. And this is my colleague Dom that I do lots of the Extinction Rebellion talks with. This is him being arrested. He was sitting a few people along from me on Waterloo Bridge, and he spoke to a senior officer during the night when he was sleeping on the bridge and was talking to him about the climate science. He spent 3 or 4 hours explaining it's not great, it's really not great. I can give you some of the headlines. The guy didn't know anything about it. Senior officer. And the next morning, as he was plucked out from all of us sitting on the bridge and walked up and put in handcuffs, the senior officer saw him through the crowd and indicated that he'd seen him. And then made his way through the crowd. He was basically saying to Dom, don't worry, it's going to be okay, because we were all really, really scared. He made his way through the crowd in his high-vis jacket and then put his hand out to shake Dom's hand, to say, I know what you're doing, and I know it's breaking my rules, and I know I have to do my job and arrest you, but I completely respect what you're doing, in full view of all the other police officers there. And Dom said it was the most moving moment of the entire 10 days that he was on Waterloo Bridge. It was a matter of respect. Peaceful respect. So we can. So in terms of why you might want to get involved in XR, we are the only game in town in terms of radical change. We have been trying to do this every other way. Some of us have been trying to do this for a really long time, and nothing's worked yet. This seems to be working. There's an argument to say inaction now is morally defensible, because we do know now. It's actually really brilliant to be doing something about this massive problem. And I've made some incredible friends. I met some extraordinary people just in the last 6 months. I can't recommend it highly enough if you're feeling low. And it means maybe doing the right thing, because we're going to be asked by our kids. You can look online, there's lots and lots of brilliant talks, and I remember not to do it alone. You might decide alcohol's a really bad idea actually, but at least have phone a friend option next to you. Look out for the Red Rebels. They're going to be around again this weekend, and with more actions, and they're simply drawing attention to something that we all. This is about fast fashion. Fast fashion is an incredibly impactful contributor to climate breakdown and ecological collapse, worse than shipping and aviation put together. So you don't need permission. You don't need permission to do the right thing, and you're here already tonight, which I can only thank you for and give you credit for. So, thank you from us both, and we would just like to say that in actual fact you can find everything about Extinction Rebellion or climate online, or talking to each other. There are many Extinction Rebellion groups happening all over the county now. And Matt, could you just come and say a little bit about what's happening here in this area?
It was fantastic. I'm just wondering, questions. It's 9:25. Should we just make a few announcements and then say we'll be in the bar? I think there's probably 1,000 questions in the room. There's about 1,000 in my head. There are things I want to go back to in Stefan's talk and Manda's as well. So anyway, yeah, Louise, if you could, have we got Louise, Paul, or anyone? If we could just put some of these. We've got leaflets here. As I said, if you sign one of these this evening, you're in deep. You might get an email. Okay? That's it. We won't come after you. We do meet in Falmouth. We meet at Falmouth Rugby Club at the moment. We had a lovely base in the Satellite Cafe, but Falmouth Rugby Club is bigger. They're friendly. We meet fortnightly at the moment. The next meeting is 7 to 9 p.m. next Wednesday at Falmouth Rugby Club. So you'll find also the little flyers that were on each seat. There's our email on there. You can contact us that way as well to start hearing from us. But if you come next Wednesday, we have a fortnightly planning meeting. We're beginning to get focused now on the next Extinction Rebellion action in London on October the 7th, as you heard. Really, that needs to grow exponentially. That needs to be a hockey stick too. You need that to be as different to what happened in April as April was to anything that came before it. So, you know, so that they just can't arrest us in silence. If they arrest 20 people, there's 200 more. If they arrest 200, there's 2,000 more. And you just keep building it like that. That's the logic. It's very simple and it's non-violent. So that we're planning that. But there'll also be local initiatives being planned, more kind of just about communicating with people locally. There's lots of strong work going on with local councils, as I said, and those things are being planned as well. There'll be an induction taking place that evening. So those who come into the meeting and don't want to get plunged straight into the kind of nitty-gritty of what we're doing and when, there'll be an introduction to those basic 3 demands and what's called the 10 principles of XR, you know, essentially a movement that puts kindness and radical determination side by side at its heart. Alongside that, we've got other, I mean, again, if you sign up, you'll hear about this. We're in communication with Falmouth Library about starting a monthly book group. Guess what's going to be the first book? It's pink, I'll give you a clue. And we're going to do that in September. And so, a reminder that you can buy a copy of that tonight. There's others that might flow out of that afterwards. Oh yes, Earthstrike. 20th to 27th of September. That's another thing we want to talk about. I think a lot of us, I know I feel this, but if there's one thing that just settles in a determination to be part of this, it's that I'm not leaving it to 12-year-olds. You know, it's like, thank God for them. Thank God for the children going and doing that. And I think for a lot of us, it's just, you can't leave it to them. So Earthstrike is saying, we need all of us. Come out and strike. I think it's a week-long strike that's been planned. People will just contribute what they can, but we'll be organising things locally around that. Anyone else want to shout out? Anyone in the XR group? Have I forgotten anything? Who's here?
Thank the councils
Yeah.
conversation with Falmouth.
Thank you, Falmouth Town Council, for the really positive reception we've had. We're really impressed with it. So let's have a definitely last but not least, Cornwall Council. You know, those of us who were there when they declared, and then when they voted on the policy that they put in place, having declared, it's incredibly moving actually to enter the kind of so-called corridors of power and see people passionate and determined to engage with this. So we're grateful to and inspired by them as well. So thank you, Cornwall Council. I think she has just recapitulated the message of the entire. We can't leave this to India or China or Penryn